This session is the key attributes for developing the internet policies. The moderator is the CEO of TWNIC, Kenny Huang. And we have Adam Chung, the CEO of .Asia, Akinori Maimura, the ICANN board member, and Paul Wilson, the Director General of APNIC. And the section will begin now.
Okay, good morning. I think the section is starting from Edmund Zhang. He prepared a presentation slide to introduce brief introduction about the internet policy, how the internet policy is made, and how stakeholders are going to develop the internet policy. So I switched to Edmund Zhang.
Okay, thank you, Kenny, and thank you, TWNIC. Thank you, ICANN, for inviting me here. Actually, I wasn't aware that I was the only one that prepared a presentation, so never mind. I was going to talk, because looking at the agenda, I was going to touch on a little bit of my own experience with the multi-stakeholder internet governance approach, some of the work that .Asia has been doing in the last while, and I guess go from there and touch on a few of the issues that I think is pertinent or as a I guess as a highlight of why a multi-stakeholder approach in internet governance is important. So first of all, I guess .Asia, I think hopefully everyone knows a little bit about us. What we do is the .Asia top-level domain. That is our income source, of course, but we operate as a non-profit organization, and so the income that comes in from .Asia registrations go to support internet development and adoption around Asia. One of the main things that we do support is actually internet governance discussion. We serve as the secretariat for the Asia-Pacific Regional Internet Governance Forum. This is I'll come back a little bit more to this, but this is one of the things that we do, and some of the observations that about multi-stakeholder approach, the bottom-up approach that Akinori mentioned earlier on is kind of realized in the model of operating and running the Asia-Pacific Regional Internet Governance Forum. It has been running since 2010. This year it's going to be, actually very interestingly, it's going to be in Vladivostok, and I checked Google Map earlier. It's actually more east to Taiwan and more east to Korea, although it is in Russia. I'll come back to that again, as just mentioned. But one of the things that .Asia has been working on in the last 10 years is engaging more stakeholders. One of the stakeholder group that is often not very well represented, and I look around the room here, is the youth. Young people are online basically all the time, and a lot of the issues that confront us, whether it's from privacy to cyberbullying or cybersecurity, hits youth a lot, as much as people, I guess, people around the room. So one of the things that actually interesting is we've been supporting a lot of engagement and training programs to get younger people who are passionate about the internet to also come as a part of the stakeholder to participate in the internet governance discussions. So. And just coming back to the policy itself, and this is a little bit of a sharing from actually, we have been running the Net Mission program, as I mentioned, the youth engagement program for the last 10 years. And I learn as much from them as I guess they learn from us. I get very much updated to some of the perspectives. And when we talk about, I think a few of the speakers earlier talked about the internet, governance of the internet versus governance on the internet. A lot of times we talk about that in my training for younger people, and I'll touch on a few interesting issues as we move as I talk about it. Earlier, someone asked if ICANN should take on, I think it was Albin, or asked whether ICANN should take on more things, and and of course the answer generally is no. But what is interesting is that ICANN is one of the models I often say and talk about is one of the working decision-making and a kind of a multi-stakeholder model in action. And it's one of the first fora around the internet that really engages what we generally call multi-stakeholder, coming from the government, the business, the industry. But before I go further on, I want to highlight that multi-stakeholder model doesn't only mean it has to be government, business, industry, technology, academia. Multi-stakeholder model is supposed to mean the relevant stakeholders coming together. And I'll come back to that when we talk about a little bit about IETF, and I think there's a significant difference there, and it's an important thing to think about when we think about policy decisions as we think, and especially regulation on the internet, that it's not always the type of ICANN model that we need to look at. It's a very good place to start thinking about things. There are very exciting things about the multi-stakeholder model. There's very different ways of imagining the multi-stakeholder model, actually. But at ICANN, why is it very interesting that people keep coming back to ICANN? It's things like these, right? I mean, when we talk about names, we talk about things that people are really passionate about. There is, when we talk about new top-level domains, there's .amazon case. I won't go into details, but there is the fight between the IP, which is the intellectual property rights of certain companies, versus governments who thinks that Amazon is part of their region. There are issues like these, .XXX. There are countries that think that, hey, this is just illegal, but there are countries that this is a freedom of expression in some ways, and this is just the market that drives it. This is the part of the reason why ICANN always gets a lot of this discussion pushed to ICANN. But it is also I think a point to talk about that these types of issues need to be dealt with in a multi-stakeholder way. There are different viewpoints. There are different viewpoints from the different stakeholders. So, and other things as well, right? The new generic top-level domains, the new GTLDs brought in what is called the internet explosion, and it brought along another issue that ICANN is often burdened with, is the imbalance of the distribution of these resources. People see these new generic top-level domains, or sometimes even IP addresses, as important public resource. But these public resources, if we look at the new GTLD, about 2,000 of them, but majority of them, actually really about half of it goes to North America, and then a good chunk goes to Europe, and very a tiny part goes to Africa and South America. Then you see, is there a policy dimension to it? And that's also a reason why ICANN is brought into the loop. All these issues that I can deal with in the names and numbers, I think is important for us as learning a process. The rest of the world or other parts of the regulation of the internet can really learn from that experience, but it does not mean that all those other types of issues of imbalance or cybersecurity needs to be brought to ICANN. So that's one of the things that I guess I wanted to mention. The other interesting thing, again, as we move forward with the new generic top-level domains, a new type of issue emerged. I think it's really not new. I'll come back to why it's not new. But we talked about internet governance as governance off the internet, the critical internet infrastructure on the internet, which is the issues like privacy and activities that happen on the internet. Another issue that happened is that with these new generic top-level domains, and in fact new protocols, there is an importance to advocate for the update of certain systems. And as we brought in new generic top-level domains, it's not just in English, it's also in Chinese, it's also in IDNs, what is called internationalized domain names. And earlier, Akinori mentioned that 50 years ago, what happened? Well, one thing is interesting. I just realized that 20 years ago, I started working on IDNs or Chinese domain names. That's 40% of the internet's history of 50 years, yet we're still thinking of them as new. That's a problem, I think. What is interesting, it's now one of the project is called Universal Acceptance. And what it means is that there are domain names and email addresses that could be in different languages or different new top-level domains. And some of the systems are still not updated to support them. And the pertinent issues, of course, from the domain name part, domain names in different languages, domain names that have longer top-level domains, email addresses that have these type of domains, and email addresses that have username parts before the @ sign, that is using Chinese or other languages or and so on. And the universal acceptance issue is something that is really interesting. Of course, it's about accepting these new top-level domains. But to me, I think it is much more than that. And is pertinent to a third leg, I think, of internet governance that we haven't really talked about. It is the advocacy of these new protocols. Protocols evolve. But the internet seems to be stuck in the past a little bit, especially in terms of these new protocols. And it's not just about these new domain names. It's also about IPv6. It's also about DNSSEC, the security extensions. This whole issue that Paul mentioned earlier on about the internet wasn't designed. Well, actually, part of the security wasn't designed in its earlier phases because it was a trusted environment. However, these protocols did evolve. There are, IETF has worked very hard and evolved these protocols. The problem is people are not adopting them. The systems out there are not fully compliant. They're not fully adopting the system. So the third leg I'm trying to advocate is it's not only just about internet governance off the internet, internet governance on the internet, but there's also an advocacy component to this to make sure we upgrade the internet especially the core protocols that we were talking about. And that brings me to, of course, IETF. And I mentioned earlier on, they use a very different concept of multi-stakeholder approach. It is still a multi-stakeholder approach, but at IETF, they like to think that it's the different areas of the technology, the applications, the network, the different layers of the protocol. They form a different stakeholder group when we talk about the actual protocol design. And that makes sense for the IETF. And when we think about policy discussion, we need to think about what makes sense for the particular policy and the particular regulation that we're talking about. And again, back to it's not just the ICANN model. But one thing that the IETF, I think, is very well known for, and it's very useful for when we talk about internet governance, is this concept of rough consensus and running code. This is often a good approach to start any kind of internet governance policy discussion. However, I would also give this warning, is that as we move forward, and if you look at ICANN and even sometimes at IETF, the resistance, how should I say it? The tendency to go into voting, the tendency to go into less of a rough consensus running code mode is going to be very, very difficult to resist. And that is one of the issues, I think, of the multi-stakeholder approach. And recently, not problems, or challenges of the multi-stakeholder approach. Recently, I've joined this IEEE working group, which is looking at AI and ethics, the algorithmic bias issue, and working on a number of standards development. And there, actually, is the first time I participate at IEEE, although I have been a member for 20 years since my graduation. This first time, and I realized that they are now also starting to reach outside of the membership and trying to bring together a multi-stakeholder discussion to establish their new standards, especially on AI. And of course, when we talk about AI, there's tons of things. What is interesting, though, is that there's a big debate in terms of internet governance, whether it has anything to do with internet governance at all, because AI is just some other computing resource and algorithm rather than what we normally talk about of internet governance off and on the internet. But this brings me finally to one of the things that I want to close with. As we think about internet governance and we think about things that are quite easily these are bad things. For example, protecting children is a good thing. Child pornography is a bad thing. One of the highlights of, I think, multi-stakeholder approach is to realize that, well, sometimes bad things are well, actually, bad things are usually bad, but how you deal with it is important. Like when we talk about child pornography, what is found is that a lot of what is being categorized as child pornography these days is self-generated stuff. Kids, well, under 18 children are, taking pictures of themselves as they engage in certain acts, and they are sharing it. And, well, they probably didn't want to share it outside of a certain group. But the key aspect there is that there are laws against child pornography. Those laws that were created to protect children are now actually hurting them. How are they hurting them? Why are they hurting? Because the laws usually say that if you possess child pornography, if you have it in your computer, you already engage in a criminal act. So the problem is the victims of these, selfies or what is now called child sexual abuse material, the victims of them are unable to go out to the law enforcement and try to get the protection they're supposed to get. And herein I want to highlight one particular issue is that laws that were created to protect certain situations like protecting child pornography, children from child pornography, is now hurting them. And that's why we need to talk about regulation. That's why when we talk about internet governance, there's no hiding away from the word regulation and updates of law. And because certain laws were created for a purpose that the internet now challenges completely. And of course, ultimately, and go back to one of the stakeholders that are often missed when we talk about children. Children is usually not in the audience, and I want to highlight that fact, especially in terms of a multi-stakeholder approach. And this is why we are running the Net Mission program. This is as I mentioned, we have been running it for 10 years. This is the first year. It has generally been from Hong Kong. This is the first year we have opened it up to across Asia, and we're quite excited about the, and I thank all the people that have, all the experts that have helped us enrich the program. And I'll jump to the last part, which is, yes, I think it's important to maintain kind of a permissionless innovation concept for the internet, and we talk about internet governance. However, regulations are equally important, and at a recent Hong Kong Internet Governance Forum discussion, we specifically focused on how regulations can actually help, because when the internet first developed and when new technologies first come along, there might not be a dominant player. But once there is a dominant player, the market forces could fail. And depending only on the market is not enough. How regulations can help actually support permissionless innovation is going to be part of what we call, I think, the global public interest. And the global public interest is found only, I think, when we have a working multi-stakeholder model. That's kind of the end of my presentation, but with part of it, if you're interested, I also hope to invite all of you to the Asia-Pacific Regional Internet Governance Forum this year, which will be held in Vladivostok, as I mentioned, in Russia, in July 16th to 19th, where a lot of these issues that I mentioned will be talked about. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund. Edmund is the only good student who makes presentation for us. Okay. Basically, Edmund tried very hard to diversify our topic. So we try to refocus on the topic. We're going to discuss the key attribute for developing internet policy and policies. And because Akinori is an ICANN board member, Paul Wilson, and also Director General at PNIC, they are fully familiar with all the internet-related policy, either from IP address policy or domain policy. So starting from Akinori, do you want to add comment regarding to from your perspective, how the internet policy will develop and how is multi-stakeholder model that can help?
Thank you very much, Kenny. And thank you very much, Edmund, for the fantastic presentation, as usual. It's really exhaustive and comprehensive. Then, yes, I said something in my keynote part. We have a lot of the various kind of rules, and then the various kind of rules need it's their own policy making process, which is fit to them. For example, what the examples I raised there was the IETF has its own rule, and then Edmund kindly pointed out that the multi-stakeholderism in the IETF is a little bit different from the ICANN's one. And then areas are diversified, and then such a diversified area directors get into the one IESG and make a decision. That's the IETF's own multi-stakeholderism. Then ICANN's multi-stakeholderism is for example, the GNSO, we have the stakeholder race 3 and race 2 stakeholder groups, and then commercial stakeholder groups and the non-commercial stakeholder groups like that. So the seller and the buyers, and then the buyers buy the intention of the buying kind of thing. That's a diversify the positions for the domain names policies. In case of the APNIC, for my knowledge, it's not really that diversified in comparison with other policies, but more the straightforward inclusiveness and then the openness worked a lot for the decision making. So this is the variety of the cases with the governance of the internet. On the internet, for example, the governmental study groups have in case that I raised in my keynote part, there was a little bit the unbalanced lineup of the members are in the task force. Then we have the contents task force of the government to consider the legislation of the contents blocking. At the time was the almost half of the contents holders, and then some of the ISPs, and then one from the Consumer Representative Association. It's imbalanced. So what we need is the experts and expertise which is needed, all expertise which is needed for the considering such a policy, and then many balanced stakeholders from the various stakes. So there is maybe it's a principle for this kind of setup, and then we may discuss further later on.
Okay, thank you. Paul, would you like to comment based on your perspective?
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Kenny. The description of the session didn't mention internet governance, but it seems that we're talking about internet governance. Is that all right with you? Is that I mean, I think although when we talk about internet public policy, when we talk about the public interest, when we talk about the issues of safety and diversity and openness and all of these things, we seem to be talking about internet governance. And the thing is, internet governance seems to be a relatively new term. It's not that new, but it's actually newer than IDN, I guess, as Edmund mentioned. It actually came about, I mean, my point is that internet governance has been around and has been in existence for much longer than we've been talking about it. And internet governance is actually as old as the internet, and internet governance is the way that the internet is governed is a secret to the internet's success. But the thing is that this was only discovered less than 20 years ago, in the early 2000s. And so just to go back into a bit of history here, it came about through something called the World Summit on the Information Society, which was one of these big United Nations conferences. And this was a conference where governments were getting together to talk about the information society, the next industrial revolution, that is, to an information society. And as they do in the UN, and very, very correctly, very properly, they're talking about how to bring the benefits of this information society to all people. So to countries, developed and developing countries across the world, how could we all implement the information society and make it work for the best of all people? So that was what the World Summit was about. And it had 4 years to discuss, quite a long time. In the first 2 years, even though the internet was not part of what they wanted to necessarily talk about, the internet became very obvious in that first period as something that was critical to the information society. So somehow, without intending to talk about the internet became a very important topic for the World Summit on Information Society. And the thing is, when you present something important to governments, governments have an automatic question, which is, how is this thing governed? And so when the internet became an obvious important feature, the question of how is it governed was the next important questions for governments, at least. And what the step that was taken then was to establish something called a working group on internet governance to actually look at the details of internet governance and how it worked. So that working group happened in the middle of the WSIS Summit, and it came back with some discoveries, and it kind of discovered that the success of the internet is actually tied to the way that it's governed. And so the term internet governance came out of that. And more of what this working group discovered was that the particular nature of internet governance is very important, and it's very particular, and this is where the multi-stakeholder model came about. So this is where they decided that multi-stakeholder internet governance was not just a sort of a feature of the internet that was interesting, but it's actually something that was part of the internet's success. Now, I think it's a little unfortunate that governance was the word that was used, because governance actually can be quite confusing, particularly in translation to different languages. In English, governance can be a process of guiding or moderating or assisting something. An old steam engine has got a governor on it, which is a device that helps to moderate the speed. And so governing is something that in English is not necessarily done only by governments. Governing is something that we can all do. But I think in some languages, governance is only done by governments, and internet governance somehow implies that it must be a government activity, which is actually never intended, although probably the governments of the United Nations weren't so sensitive to that fact. I think if I had the time over again, I'd be preferring a word like cooperation, to say that the internet success is built on cooperation, and it's a multi-stakeholder cooperation that is the secret to the internet's success. From AP-NIC's point of view, I mean, we've been involved with internet governance since before internet governance was discovered, for the last 25 years, and we've done it according to the same internet model that was discovered by the World Summit. Just like ICANN. ICANN came along and is also in its operations attempting to be an example of and to be compliant with this sort of model of multi-stakeholder internet governance or cooperation. Likewise, the IETF, and I think, in some sense, we can say we've been doing this in the same way for many years. Actually, that's not quite true. I think what all of the technical organisations and the technical community has learnt and has understood by talking about internet governance is that in order to play our part, we need to be part of a multi-stakeholder process. So it used to be that we were merely just open organisations and anyone could come and participate. You know, the door was open, but I mean, that's kind of irrelevant to people who don't even know that the door is there. So, you know, not only do you have to have an open door, but you need to be prepared to go out through that door and engage with people who you know have got an interest in what you do and to bring them in. And I think that's where a multi-stakeholder process is actually something that's not just passive and open, but it's one where you are actually engaging with other stakeholders in a deliberate effort, in an effort that's costly actually. It takes time and effort and money, frankly, to engage actively and to say, well, we're not just here waiting for people to come to us, but we'll go out to others who we know have a stake and who are interested in what we do. So, I mean, at AP-NIC, so one of the things that we did some time ago was we established a special session in our regular conferences, and we call it the Cooperation SIG. So we didn't call it an internet governance session, we called it an internet cooperation session. And that is a session which happens at every conference twice a year, and that's particularly to look at an agenda of topics which kind of overlap between AP-NIC's community interest and others. It could be things to do with security, for instance, relationships with governments or law enforcement on security. It could be a variety of different topics under this banner of cooperation. And so the cooperation SIG, I guess, is one example of how we've kind of changed to the extent of really trying more actively to be part of a multi-stakeholder community, even if we're not, even if we are merely sort of just a technical community largely. And I'll mention actually that it's Joy Chan from TWNIC, Deputy CEO, who's one of the co-chairs of the Cooperation SIG. So Joy was elected just at the last meeting, and I thank you, Joy, for your preparedness to help with that important part of APNIC's agenda. I think that's all for now. Thanks.
I think it's, sorry. Akinori, do you want to comment something? Okay, sorry. Okay, well, I agree with Paul. Basically, when we're talking about governance or either policies, basically policy will be more concentrate on the day-to-day operation with what we do. And when we focus on the policy from internet community point of view, for example, like APNIC, APNIC focus on numbering policy and IP address policy. And ICANN focus on domain policy, and IETF focus on protocol policy. They have protocol policy, okay. But anyway, so how is the policy is made? I think most of people, they are curious how the policy was made, and how can they claim the multi-stakeholder model can help in developing such kind of policy. For example, if I can claim it's a multi-stakeholder model, whether ICANN policy process will be better than UN policy process. And do you want to comment on this?
I guess I'll get started, and but so you touched on a question on whether the multi-stakeholder model, I guess, makes more sense or is more effective. I think it's for ICANN specifically, one of the concepts, at least as I experienced it through the GNSO, the generic name supporting organization discussion for the generic top-level domains, just to make sure everyone knows what I'm talking about. There are policies that are being, the issue is that when we create internet policies, especially global policies, there are situations where you're creating policies and you do know, as Paul said, you do know that certain stakeholders who would be interested in it is not there yet, right? And part of the multi-stakeholder model from ICANN's development is to really invite them in, create that seat or create those stakeholder groups and then invite them in. And it's an proactive approach to pull people in. And I think that's part of when you talk about internet governance on the international level. I think that's why it worked, or maybe sometimes people think that's why it doesn't work, because still you're not reaching the people. But what is relevant to local policy development or local legislation is that particular part, is the ability, the effectiveness of this proactive multi-stakeholder approach is to identify those stakeholders and then invite people in, at the same time keeping the doors open. And that's the hard part. One of the issues about multi-stakeholder is once people sit there, there's some kind of capture and the door starts closing slightly. And I think part of the effectiveness of a multi-stakeholder approach, both at the international level and at the local level, will be the test will be whether you've created the right stakeholder groups and it's pertinent to the issue that you want to talk about, and also whether that door remains open. Just because you go proactively invite people in, just because you create those stakeholder groups, doesn't mean that the door gets closed. And also the last thing I want to talk about is that those stakeholder groups that originally get started may change as you go along, as you discuss those issues. And those are some of the challenges and some of the, I guess, learning from ICANN and the international multi-stakeholder approach. And if we can do that, I think it will be more effective than the usual other policy development processes.
Okay, Akinori, do you want to comment, especially for the multi-stakeholder model?
No, I concur all points which that Edmund raised here. So yes, the ICANN is quite what I said, the special. ICANN was established in a really special occasion that the U.S. government in a green paper and white paper in 1998, I think, was their intent to transfer the management of the domain name system and the DNS to the some community, the private sector, based on the community of the multi-stakeholder, by the multi-stakeholders, which is written in the blueprint. Then that's ICANN is inherently has been seeking the format of the multi-stakeholder written by that, and then rather experimentally we have been tackling on that. And then these days we have somehow established scheme for discussing the domain names policies. So that's how the ICANN is located. So in that sense, the multi-stakeholderism is quite a theme of us. And then because that was the big theme for us, we need to invest a lot of money to establish. Then we don't care. Don't care, but not a very good word. But we could invest the certain money onto the that endeavor. So that's a quite the interesting the circumstances where the ICANN's own version, ICANN's own multi-stakeholderism was developed. So yes, in the case the ICANN's multi-stakeholderism is quite well designed, and then it is to be open that everyone can join the discussion circle, and then they can put some proposal if they comply the policy process. Then the multi-stakeholder balance is already always considered, and then periodically we do the review. So there is the what say the most advanced level which we could achieve. So that's actually the situation of the ICANN. And then this kind of the situation is, I don't think this kind of situation happen often in the other circumstances. Then I'd like to discuss the other cases, and then I guess that such kind of the quite multi-stakeholder setup is not really the easy to implement. Thank you.
Okay, before move to the poll, I just a few words regarding to my experience working with the APNIC. Because Edmund just mentioned for internet governance institution basically was is inclusive and keep the door open. And that's my experience when I working with the APNIC. For example, like APNIC is a member-based organization. Most of the traditional member was ISP, and they come from different telecommunication company in different countries. Yeah, not in different countries, in Asia-Pacific countries. But basically, most of the members, they have very similar nature. So I don't know whether it's so-called multi-stakeholder or not. But basically, because of the same nature of the member, so a lot of people outside this regime, they claim they want to participate, especially when different countries, they have different telecommunication regulation, which could be possibly contradictory to APNIC policies. So for example, like a public sector regulator, they probably want to identify their IP policy as well. I think it happened in Korea. And that's why we have been established another working group, as Paul just mentioned, called Cooperation SIG. The purpose for Cooperation SIG is try to invite more broad participants, for example, like people from public sector to participate in APNIC meeting. And they propose their idea, they sharing their soul regarding to the address policy. And that's the original goal for the Cooperation SIG. And so I move to the Paul, if you want to add something. Okay, I think the initial round for our discussion will be adjourned here. So I leave the mic open to the floor. If you have any question, please go to the mic and say your name and your affiliation. And you can raise any specific question regarding to the internet policy to any of the panelists. Any question?
Jeff Houston from APNIC. I think this is actually really down to the heart of a lot of the discussion, because what you're touching upon is public economics and the governance of the public domain of communications. We've traditionally done this in two quite distinct ways. Representative democracy, where all of the interests in a particular matter have their representatives who sit in a room and bash it out. And whatever comes is meant to be a result of compromise, not amongst those people in the room, but amongst the parties that they represent. And this is where traditionally we've used governments and government-based systems, the public economy. On the other hand is Adam Smith and open market economics. There is no policy, there's just competition. And the entities that thrive are the ones that produce goods that consumers want, and consumers want efficiently, the cheapest producer of desirable goods. And in Adam Smith's world, there are no policies, there's just competition. In this multi-stakeholder world that we're trying to foster, we seem to be trying to create what I suppose is the best of both worlds. That you are trying to create both competition and a certain form of representation at the same time. And over the last 10 years, I would give our score a P. Just a pass, bordering to a fail. So I'd like your reaction to the following comment. One of the major things that governments try and do is to keep markets healthy, to stop overarching dominance, centralising it, eliminating choice and destroying the market. How can the multi-stakeholder regime combat the incessant centralisation that we're seeing? A few quick examples. I want to publish a website that has to be available no matter what, no matter how big the attack. I think I have only 5 people that I can go to. Not 500, just the big 5. I want my DNS resolved. How many folk offer open DNS? To what extent is choice being eliminated, and to what extent does this multi-stakeholder regime get out of just the stakeholders are there and no one else, and actually try and introduce true public interest back into this? How do you react against centralisation and consolidation that's happening in the internet? I don't expect answers. This is a really hard question, but I would like some reactions to this, because I think this is today's debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff Houston didn't forget to introduce himself. Jeff Houston, Chief Scientist of APNIC. Okay, any panelists try to comment on Jeff's question? It's a very tough question.
Well, I think the question was asked about what the technical community would have to offer, and I think I hope the technical community has some expertise to offer about exactly what are the implications of some of the policies or lack of policies that exist. The other question, though, is how that expertise can be heard, and that's where, in theory, where the IGF comes in. So the Internet Governance Forum, which Edmund also covered, that was actually an outcome of the World Summit on Information Society, because at the end of that 4-year period, they did decide that internet governance was important and global and sort of long-standing enough to deserve to have this annual event, and that annual event has been going on for 15 years. But I would say definitely in that annual event, there have been sessions and discussions that have happened on quite a number of occasions which have been influential for policymakers and people who've been there, because there's been an open dialogue which has allowed someone like Jeff to come in and throw a really kind of a new perspective that people may not have seen or heard before, and to understand that, well, if we do regulate in this way, then here are the sort of technical issues or threats or risks that we might face, or here are some technical outcomes that might actually come about from our current regime, and we need to do something about them. And I can't summon any examples right now, but I think, and they're hard to find, because the IGF is not for making decisions about these things, but as they say, it's a meeting not for decision making, but for decision makers. So as I say, I think there's absolutely doubtless many decision makers who've been influenced and who could have made better decisions as a result of that process, at least.
That's a great question, and in fact, that's exactly the question that I was trying to ask. And I touched on it. I'm glad that you picked it up. In the past, we've relied really heavily. The internet governance model have relied a lot on the market-driven thing. When we talk about rough consensus and running code, especially, that's really the market-driving thing. But this concept of internet governance now coming in and growing up with a concept of representation, that's the part we need to figure out, I think. I truly think about that. That's the part we need to figure out. About 4 or 5 years ago, I because of the situation in Hong Kong, by the way, I wrote a series of articles based around that. What is a gold standard for a multi-stakeholder approach, and how do we bring what we call democracy into that and representation into that without ruining what we have? It's a very difficult question. You're very right. One thing before I talk about the main point I want to say, Adam Smith actually does talk about the regulatory part as well. We remember him mostly for the market-driven force, but if you read his book, he talks a lot actually about the other side as well. So, and this goes back to my presentation. I wanted to bring out something I thought was kind of new, is that besides governance of the internet, on the internet, we need to get this thing working, which is people to upgrade the internet. That part will be if we are successful in that, and you mentioned what we're kind of passing and failing. If you only look at that part, we're completely failing. I mean, for the last 20 years, we haven't been able to move people to better protocols, the more evolved protocol. And if we figure that one out, we can figure out the centralization issue, because I think that's pertinent to it. The reason why, that's just purely personal view, the centralization has happening is that the market forces, there is an imbalance right now of the market forces, and we are unable as a global community, global multi-stakeholder community, if you will, to push the evolution of standards to battle against it. So yes, people will feel that it's self-serving, that I think universal acceptance and DNSSEC, IPv6 are important. But if we don't figure those out with the multi-stakeholder approach, this centralization thing and the whole model will be purely market-driven, and we will have lost the other side of when market failure happens. I don't have an answer to that. I think that's exactly the place where we need to try to figure out.
Thank you. Kaveh Ranjbar, RIPE NCC. So a bit of clarification, because I think Jeff oversimplified the situation by setting up the question. In my view, there are two very different aspects here. And yes, for example, IETF tries to standardize over the whole arena, but actually, and it's maybe not Adam's been a bit further, Friedman, but basically the same idea. I agreed. At the end, there is no regulation from that point of view. There is talk of regulation, but that's self-regulation, industry-driven, so that's basically within the same market. But what we are dealing with, and when we deal with limited resources, which, for example, like a piece of land or namespace or address space, that changes the whole thing. So we have to keep in mind, there are two very different playing grounds. When you're talking about permissionless innovation on the internet, coming up with protocols and all of that, as long as you're not dealing with a limited resource, no issue at all. As soon as you get into discussions of a limited resource, then which you assess that it belongs to everyone. For example, there is this small piece of land, which is this namespace, and you say, hey, this is for everyone in the world. This is not only for this type of companies or governments or whatever. .com is for everyone, as an example. Then you will have the issues of, okay, how do we regulate that? Because there is no way, you cannot put that to free market, but except if you say, oh, it's not for everyone, it's for people who want to play in that market. That's the dilemma, and that's where you have this problem. So, and yes, in a forum like IETF, you deal with basically both of them, because they come up with standards, which sometimes cover numbers or names, but mostly the other part, the protocols, which in that sense, it really doesn't matter, because they play in basically an unlimited space. So, and this is true, this is the same for the markets. When you talk about frequency, governments have exactly the same issues, because they say, hey, this frequency space belongs to the whole nation, and everybody lives, basically every single citizen. But then they have to regulate to make sure best operator gets to run it, and they sell it, they get, or they rent it, lease it, for the highest amount, just to be able to get the most amount of money, so to invest back into the infrastructure for citizens. So this is a bit challenging, and Adam Smith doesn't answer that part, because this model fails when you go to limited resources which you want to allocate or you think is for everyone. As long as you have this criteria, you cannot simply answer that by saying free market. But in general, internet, except this part of the internet, the rest of internet is permissionless innovation, and basically is free market, do whatever you want. And that's how it's grown. We have observed it over past 30, 40, 50 years, how it has grown. And yes, you don't need to ask permission, it's free, and it's free competition.
Okay, thank you. Any comment?
Yeah, I think the market regulation is a very good example of where governance actually happens, and we're all very familiar with governments acting on markets to ensure competition, to regulate against anti-competitive behaviour, to actively encourage competition, to break up companies which are too large, etc., etc. I think it's a mistake, and I say this as someone who comes from the technical community, it's a mistake to try and reinvent all regulations through a technical kind of mindset. And I'm not an expert in this area, but I sort of tend to think that net neutrality is an example of that mistake, in that there was a great deal of work and a great deal of uncertainty and confusion and technical complexity behind the idea of network neutrality, whereas what network neutrality is actually trying to achieve in many cases is just a level playing field, and it's trying to regulate against anti-competitive behaviour or monopolistic behaviour. And perhaps it would have been better to have been seen and phrased in that regard, simply as a question of how those companies are behaving in a competitive sense, rather than what they're technically doing. But I think when we try to put the technology into legislation, it becomes, and the technical concepts so deeply into legislation, it seems to be very difficult. But actually, governments are quite good at regulating markets and aspects of society, bringing us to where we are today.
Now, in case of the ICANN, I have the twofold. In case of the ICANN, ICANN, the one of the mission is the introducing the competition to the domain names market, and then that's actually maybe I can say it is successful. Then we have the increased competition, and then we have the lot of TLD race who are competing each other. Then, we then see the phenomena to if the market is open, then we have the tremendous amount of the waste reads, but back end is quite limited numbers. That's actually what the economy tells us. So that's what we are looking at. Then another part, market regulation is really good. The topic for the discussion. We actually had some myth or expectation that that in the 20 years ago that the internet would introduce a tremendous mobility, and then the suburban area will be vitalized by that mobility to run the business in the suburban, the marginal area, not suburban, sorry. So the internet will eliminate the limitation of the geography and distance. Then the margin, we can do the business even in the marginal area. That's one of the concepts. But the reality is not really like that. What is happening is right now is the mobility only almost only serves to the bigger player in quite urban area. Then urban area, big player can serve the marginal area. Then the centralization increased from that in the pre-internet era. So that's exactly what we are seeing these days in a global scale. Well, quite a less than handful players are quite dominant in the global internet market. Then the really big question is how to address the disadvantage by decentralization. Then we don't have the answer yet.
Thank you. Any question?
Hello, my name is Vincent from NII Association. And my question is that Asia, that APNIC, that ICANN's model you talk about a multi-stakeholder model, and from bottom-up process for the policy development process. But suppose in Taiwan's case is like NCC and the other government agency already aware those kind of the name of the multi-state model, but but they still do not know how to proceed the process. And my question is some people say that the government department cannot apply the multi-stakeholder model, and the difference between the ICANN and APNIC and even TWNIC different with the government agencies concept. So it's difficult to persuade the government officials to try to these models. It's difficult to get a further proceed to.
This is where I'd say again there are existing models that governments themselves use. We don't have to necessarily reinvent, but many countries have got self-regulatory structures where governments deliberately ask industries to regulate themselves and to work out their own policies for certain actually quite important issues. It could be media self-regulation, it could be advertising self-regulation.
Yes, but
this exists already, and so sometimes it's quite useful to be able to describe what we are looking for in internet governance in terms that governments themselves actually might better understand.
Because the bottom-up process and the always government thinking model is the top-down process, top-down to bottom, and the decision mechanism in the multi-stakeholders, all of the decision mechanism all include multi-stakeholders, right? So it's difficult to say that government's decision mechanism include the multi-stakeholders concept there? Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chen. I'm actually, would like to raise some example in Japan that yes, the government is inherently the top-down process because we the national choose the representative to the parliament or diet, and then they form the party, and then says the administration, and then name the head of the bureaucrats, and then do the government. But then that's in that way that the legitimacy, the trickle down to us. That's the situation. Then what we are doing right now is with that. That's if we need to live with that. What we can do is to provide a good source of the expertise to have them do the really good informed decision. So in that term, the ministries are quite keen to do the working group and the task force to collect the expertise from the various specialization. Then that's a little bit better, not the perfect, but still we have the we have the very good room for the improvement, but still getting better. Thank you.
That's a great question, and I guess building on what Paul just mentioned, there's one view that the governments are good at what they do, and so we should let them do. There's also a view, as I mentioned about 5 years ago, I did a bit of a study of democracy, development, and representation. There's also a view that because of the challenge of the internet or the support or opportunity, the governance process, especially in terms of representation or the selection of representatives and how they vote, could also be updated. And I point to two particular parts. One, in terms of multi-stakeholder approach, I think it works. It naturally works better in the consultation process. Governments always go out for consultation, and it's sometimes just kind of like a public comment period, and everyone can just come in. But if it's structured in a multi-stakeholder way, as mentioned, if there's different seats and different stakeholder groups, especially invited, that might actually enhance the process. I guess I personally believe that why governments don't like that is because it's out of control, right? I mean, they're more comfortable with developing compromise among known people, but once you open it up, then new people can come in. That control is harder to get. But I think that the main thing I wanted to stress on is the consultation process. You can really think about it, and I really like the work from Professor James Fishkin on deliberative democracy, and how that adds to the multi-stakeholder approach. I think that would be interesting for governments to look at in the consultation process. And then the other process is the decision-making process, which is the parliament or the Congress, how they vote and how the representation works. There, I think what is useful to perhaps look at is the liquid democracy thing that in Sweden and Germany, the Pirate Party has been working on, and that's a very interesting concept to rethink how representation might work in a kind of internet informed world. But both of them are probably way out of our lifetime that could be implemented. Hopefully not. But I think there is work that there could be a potential future that multi-stakeholder concepts or spirit. You mentioned that it's in name, but not really in spirit. That spirit could be introduced, but it has to be, as Paul said, it has to be through those discussions, not necessarily coming from this and say, hey, government, you should do this. I mean, I think that's the thing, I think.
Sorry, just add a few words regarding to the question, because I'm probably just in the right position, especially I speak Chinese. Okay, basically, a multi-stakeholder model is just a model. Model is just like a format. It doesn't imply for a cure, or it doesn't imply for a solution. But what government need is a solution. It's better to be solved all the problem tomorrow morning. So that we prefer very elite management because they prefer very top-down decision. If the top-down decision cannot make it, they just replace the top. So the traditional government trying to do. So if you're talking about a bottom-up decision, multi-stakeholder process, it is just a format. He's probably good at dealing with some specific scenario, for example, like making domain name policies, making IP address policy, or making protocol policy. They're pretty good at making that kind of policy, but probably didn't apply to all regime. For example, like disinformation, probably like the other area, like OTT operation. So it's just a model. That's it. Question?
Yes. Oh. Yes, I'm Andrew Jem. I'm from NII too. I guess this question is addressed to Edmund. Well, but if anyone else want to jump in, please. So I remember last year in APR-IGF, you were talking about how non-tech people should really get involved in IETF too. I hope I got it right. I mean, I love the idea. I would love to go to IETF, but how? Like, I don't know anything about what I saw the agenda this year for the Prague IETF thing, and I was like, okay, I know nothing about this, but how do I participate? I mean, it's a good proposal, but how, in practically, how do you do that? How do you, when you encourage people, how can they really get involved in those technical things? Is it that we all have to learn more about the technical stuff, or is it that the technical community, maybe they should, you know, make more efforts to open more workshops for our, you know, ignorant people? So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I'll start, and maybe others can chime in. It's a good question, but the main thing, as you were saying, this is what I talked about at APR-IGF, and many of the youth program that I would encourage non-technical people to also go to the IETF or look at what they're doing. Two things. One, a lot of the work at IETF are protocols. It's almost like on a piece of paper you say, these bits and bytes are going to say this, and I'm going to pass this to you. That part is understandable by laymen. The implications, the technical implications may not be, right? But so I think the first thing is to understand what are we talking about as a protocol. It's that part could be understood. Once you understand that part, then you should not focus on the technical implications. What you can focus on is other issues like privacy implications, like human rights implications, or other implications that affect the non-technical part of it. You can listen into all the debates, the very confusing debates of why technically this is going to kill my system. You don't have to understand all of that, but the first thing is to understand what is being talked about as a protocol, because the protocol part is really just, I'm passing you this bit and this is how you should interpret it. Understand that, and then think about how that would implicate, the issue that you're concerned with. That's, I guess, my view of it.
Okay, no, it's worked. Kavar Ansberg again from RIPE NCC. I happen to volunteer for IETF leadership for 3 years, so I know the practical answer to that. Of course, what Edmund said in general is correct, but specifically if you want to participate in IETF and you don't have the experience in the past, there are 3 pathways. One is a mentorship program. It's very easy. You basically can ask for a mentor. I actually have been mentored for 2 or 3 meetings. The only caveat with that is it works best if you know at least what area you want to focus on. So for example, you might say, hey, DNS is my interest, and then your mentor can help a lot. Second one is IETF fellowship program, which is actually ISAC IETF fellowship program, so you can actually apply for a fellowship. And if you get it, then it also comes with a bit of introduction and mentorship. And of course, at the start of each IETF, there is basically a half day of trainings you can join. And third, if you are a policymaker in your government, ISAC has, Internet Society has a policymaking track, which basically they gather policymakers, they take them to IETF. If I remember correctly, there is a 3-day program which they basically mentor them and they basically show them around. So it's a full program if you're a policymaker. So these are these 3 ways to enter IETF
especially if you're not specifically technical.
Thank you. I think mentorship is very important. So try to find your mentor. Get an application form from Jeff Houston. Okay, any other questions? Okay, if no more questions, do you want to finalize to comment before adjourn the meeting?
Thank you very much. That's really good and active discussion with what I say, a lot of surprises. No. but really good and active discussion. And yes, the public policy discussion. My idea, before the beginning was that we would go into other part of the policies like human rights and child porn and such, like other than the internet infrastructure policies. But here we come to this part, and then yes, yes, internet governance and the governance of the ICANN's discussion itself is still evolving, and then 20 years. Made us the current situation, but I'm really happy to observe the new discussion for the ICANN's governance in the previous ICANN meeting in Kobe, and then we are now call for other innovation and innovative idea for our ICANN's governance. So please join us for the discussion for the future scheme of our decision making. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. This has been an interesting discussion, and what I think is very nice to see is the number of people in the room and the amount of attention, some of the interactions that we've had. My experience in Taipei in the past has always been that there's a very open and interested approach to these questions of internet governance. I would encourage everyone here, who I'm sure has got some relationship with the internet in terms of the work that you do, to see yourselves as part of internet governance. So I'm sure we have many different roles here of providers and users and regulators and vendors and others. But everyone here, if you're active in the internet environment in any way, you have a part in internet governance, and so I would ask you and remind you not to be scared off by that term at all, not to see it as something outside, but something that you can engage with. And the nature of the internet is that all of us are connected in some way or other as service providers, vendors, clients, customers, peers, or otherwise. And we all can have a part to play and help each other in making sure that in this part of the world, the internet governance, so to speak, is being carried out with the interests of everyone at heart. So I do hope this session has encouraged some level of interest and engagement ongoing and into the future. Thank you.
So briefly, in building on what I guess actually what Paul said, I think it's clear that the internet has evolved, the type of users have evolved, and as Paul mentioned, that we discovered this multi-stakeholder approach. It has been the secret sauce or the success of the internet. However, we have evolved. The problem that right now, internet governance and multi-stakeholder approach, I think, is we at ICANN, for example, we have all these reviews at IGF. We talk about kind of reforms. Are they actually going to be able to make a difference and evolve is going to be the big test for multi-stakeholder approach now. And I really think, I would like to emphasize we have internet governance of the internet, on the internet. We now need to figure out how we get everyone to upgrade the internet. And if the multi-stakeholder approach couldn't do that, then we will move from a P to an F, as Jeff mentioned.
Okay, thank you. And before I adjourn this section, can we give a big hand to all panelists? Okay, thank you. So during the session, the meeting will be starting from 2 o'clock this afternoon, and lunch will be ready somewhere. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Information. The morning section is over. We would like to remind you that the section with interpretation service is over now. Please return your headset to the translation desk. The next session will begin at 2 p.m. You can also scan the QR code at the back of your card to receive our survey gifts.